All right. Thanks for being here, Emily E. Fink, musician, actor, designer. I might say auteur, if we're going to go that way, which includes a lot of things. But how do you find songs and poetry are different?
Honestly, I don't find them very different at all, especially because I have often written poems that I have turned into songs, or vice versa, written lyrics for songs that I've turned into poems. So, personally, my style of writing is very poetic, and I have found that incorporated into both when I write poetry as well as in my music. From a more format standpoint, there are differences uh, in, say, the difference between pop songs and something like an art song, which art songs tend to be taken directly from poetry, but pop songs uh, tend to be more in a musical direction. The formatting is different with, a song having a verse and then a chorus and then a bridge, and poems don't really have that kind of thing. But from a context wise, I find them to be very similar.
How do you tell the difference when you're writing something that this is going to be a song or this is a poem, or
I
is there a
think
difference?
I think for me it'll come down to sometimes just where the rhymes are falling. If I am feeling it being very structured with rhyming in places that would feel more poetic, I'll kind of lean in more into that in writing it as a poem as opposed to a song lyric. But uh, to me, they're just kind of interchangeable.
When you're writing them, do you feel like they're coming from a different place, or do you visualize a place where writing poetry and music come from?
Um, a little bit, I guess, and for me, they both kind of come from the same place, a place of a lot of times introspection, a lot of times just an appreciation of the world and an observation of the world, and uh, so I think they kind of come from the same place.
Where do you do most of your writing?
I'll do it anywhere, honestly. I have done a lot of writing in the car, actually. Maybe it's just because I spend a lot of time in the car, traveling from one place to another. But I tend to do a lot of writing in the car. I guess, looking out the window or just having the time on your hands, just sitting there, being able to, because I don't normally drive, and so I'm just the passenger, and so I get plenty of time to sort of just think and talk and ponder things, look out the window, and I tend to write a lot of my lyrics in the car. I guess now that I think about it.
Is there a way that you found, if you were thinking, okay, I want to write a song now, that you would try to connect with whatever that creative source or get in that creative mindset of songwriting? Like either is it music you can think about, place, pictures? How can you get into that creative mindset?
I've actually found, because years ago when I started writing, I wouldn't really had an answer to that. It was just sort of like, I'm inspired, I'm gonna write now. I have it in my head and I'm just gonna write it down. But over the years, I've discovered, and it's more so not that I've created this process, I've just realized that this is what happens, and I've sort of learned how to make it happen on its own. By I will put it in my mind that I want to write something, and I'll have kind of an idea of what I want to write about, and I'll just leave it in my head, and I won't actually consciously be thinking about it. I'll it'll be in the back of my mind as I go along doing things, but I have to be careful not to get my mind focused on other things, really. So a lot of times that'll mean staying off of the internet, staying off of social media, because that can really bog down my mind. And so it's allowing my mind some free space to just kind of go and kind of explore my own head and thoughts that I have, and I just kind of let that ponder for a little bit, and when I feel like I get an idea, and I'll sit down and just kind of let it flow out, all of this stuff that my mind's kind of been building up subconsciously. I don't
I
know that
like,
I've explained that really well, but that's what it feels like is happening.
no, that's good. Number one, it's, I see a lot of truth in, it's not something that you can maybe set out as a formula for everyone and you say this, and this, and you'll be able to write a song. That
I've
you have
tried
to figure it out how it works for you. And I think
Right.
that's different
I've
for everyone.
tried to write in a very formulaic way, and it doesn't really work for me. It always ends up feeling very forced. It sounds very forced, and I I hate the thought that, oh, well, I can't write. I have to wait for inspiration to find me, because there's so much to be inspired by. We have to let ourselves be inspired, and I think that's kind of at the heart of the process that I was trying to explain. It's giving your mind the free space to be inspired by things and ponder those things, because we get so busy, like I said, and especially with things like social media and scrolling through stuff sort of mindlessly, where we're not really allowing ourselves the time to think and feel. And it's giving myself that space to be able to do that. So it's a little bit of kind of waiting on myself. So, I couldn't necessarily, if you gave me a topic, I couldn't necessarily write a song in the next 5 minutes. It might depend on the topic, if it's something I've already have in my head. But I could, if I gave myself a little bit of space to just kind of mull over it for a little while.
Yeah. I think the spirit of collaboration can hit too. Like if you see places like on the podcast or show Song Exploder, where they look at a specific song and where it came from and all the little pieces of it and how they put it together. Very interesting. But when you see people that are like, I've invited this other person over, we're going to work on a song. And then
Mhm.
they're just starting from scratch on a song, that I would think that the first thing you're going to do is, who's the person that wants to write the song? And then you go, okay, tell me a little about what kind of song you want to write. And now you're inviting that creativity in the air. That's the time for for me, writing is first listening and then thinking and then writing.
Mhm.
And I think that's that listening part is what I would call that part that you talked about, giving it space and room in your head. That's you're listening to something, whether it's your
Yeah.
subconscious trying to tap into something more than ourselves or whatever. That's the thing that a lot of people, I don't think, do or ignore. And then I think that's the thing you can develop for yourself, is how do you connect with that source of creativity wherever it comes from, and give yourself that space. Is you have to listen and then go, oh, okay. And then the difference between a writer and not a writer is you're going to write it down. So
Yeah.
you're in the grocery store and you think about a line or you hear something and you go, oh, it's the sound, it's the words, it's the way the words sound, not even the words. And you go, oh, I got to write that down. Whether it's you're trying to vocalize it, write down what a sound sounds like. That's fun to do sometimes. And then just writing the words down. If for me, if you're doing poetry or lines in a book or whatever, that you write that down and then come back to it later. You may not have time to do a whole lot with it right then, but that's the difference between the writer and not a writer.
Mhm.
Is either you have the notepad in your pocket you're going to write it down on, you're writing it down in your phone, which is, I used to worry about, am I going to lose my notepad? And then when I started keeping the notes in the phone, now I worry, like, is this going to erase? And should I email it to myself so I have it at least there? But what if that gets erased? And then I think if that happens, then there's something going on in the world that's worse than me forgetting a line or not writing it down. There's something's going on. But
Yeah.
it's it's getting that time to listen and then doing the next step, which is writing. And maybe it's thinking about it too in different drafts or whatever. But
Mhm.
when people sit down and write music or songs together. That's why I think you could just, and not a usual time for creativity, not just a weird time for it. You're stuck in an elevator with somebody and they happen to be a songwriter, and you're like, okay, let's write a song about being stuck in the elevator. Number one, it's topical, and now how are we going to start it? So yeah, I like the collaboration mindset. And then even if there's not a person there, it feels like when you're really getting into the creativity of things, that it is you are working with something else. It's not just you pushing the pen. I can tell when that's happening and it's really clunky, but when you tap
Absolutely.
into whatever else, it's something.
Yeah, and especially as a Christian, in really wanting to use the gifts that I feel like God has given me and let them be open to Him using them how He wants, it definitely feels like that. And like you said, you can tell the difference between when it's you it's you saying the words as opposed to it feels like the words are coming from or the music is coming from somewhere else. And I'll always give the glory back to God for that because I know that I am not capable of that on my own. And so it has to be coming from Him.
The instrument, not the hand. Yes.
Exactly.
Yes, I agree. So then with songwriting, did that get you into just regular writing too, or were you doing regular writing before music?
I have always written. There've been many things in my life that I've wanted to be growing up, but one of the earliest was, according to my mom, the first thing I have ever said I wanted to be was an arter, and an artist. I did not know what it was called,
Oh, okay.
and after that, the next thing I remember being was a writer, and that went back and forth. And I would write stories all the time. I started writing poetry when I was maybe 8 or 9, and so I've always written, I've always had a love for storytelling. And so I actually didn't start writing songs until a lot later in my life. And it, I think, has definitely grown my desire to write other things though as well. I write and publish short stories, and I have a couple of bigger works that I'm still working on, but I just love writing. I love the written word and the spoken word, and that manifests itself, like you said, through poetry as well as music, and also through stories.
Yeah, I like trying the other types of writing that you don't think you would like, or that you don't have experience with, because it adds to the other. Like
Mm-hmm.
script writing, I used to think I mean, if somebody talks about adapting a book to a movie, you think, well, I used to think, why is that a big deal? It's all right there in front of you.
Right.
And then when I started looking at scripts and going, oh, this is different, and you start trying to write it yourself and you go, it's going to make me better at this other type of writing because you can mix it in. So
Mm-hmm.
it's like, I feel like the dialogue is better when you practice writing scripts, and then because you don't not waste, but you don't spend so much time on the visualization of things. You just say outside grocery store night, and then you go into the dialogue. You don't have to
Right.
explain the parking lot and the lights and all that. And then, even then, when you're writing the scene, it's just a suggestion to the director. Like
Mm-hmm.
the director could have a different vision for this than you do. It could come out differently. And then that's the importance of a good actor, is the words that, I mean, the script has to be good. The words have to be good. But if you have a person that's not doing well delivering them, it doesn't matter how good they are, they're not going to be good. So
Absolutely. Yeah, talk about a much more collaborative medium. Film is extremely collaborative. Whereas, you could write a novel or a story or a book or something just by yourself. It doesn't really take anybody else more than just one person. But creating a film, it is a whole lot bigger than that screenplay.
yeah, for me, the pathway to that was writing novels myself, and then writing novels as a with someone else. So we'd talk about the story, and then he would write a chapter, I'd write a chapter, he'd write a chapter, I write a chapter. But then you can also go back and change what the other person wrote. So it teaches you a lot of how to just let go and
Yeah.
and listen more and think, okay, this isn't what I saw, but this other thing could work okay. So then you go with it. And on a doing a script or a movie, I can imagine, because I haven't done it with I haven't made a movie, but writing the script and then thinking of all the moving parts of everybody putting their thoughts into it, it is completely different. You just have to be able to let it go.
Yeah.
I think that's difficult also when you're trying, if you have that vision for it, like if you're the writer director, that's going to be tough because now you're directing the actor. The actor's getting a little bit of say on how they do it, but I mean, you could change it around. It's interesting. Have you done film with a writer director, like in your acting? Have you done worked with a writer director versus just a director that's doing something else that someone else wrote?
I have not, only because most of my acting experience has come from myself. So if I can include myself in that, I just tend to, uh, I do everything myself, basically. Obviously, there comes a time when you can't do everything yourself. You need another person. If I needed another actor, I couldn't play two parts, something like that. But I am normally, like for my music videos, I have written the song. I come up with the concept for the music video. I direct it. My sister is my director of photography because I can't always be behind the camera and in front of the camera at the same time. But even then, sometimes I take over and do some of the filming of things that I'm not in. But I'm also in front of the camera, so it's collaborative, but it's very much my idea, my execution, and I'm the one giving orders, kind of. So I haven't had as much chance to work with other people on things like that as I would desire, just because I haven't had those opportunities. But I would definitely love to sometime. But most of my experience has just come from working with myself.
Have you done any co-writing of stories or music?
Um, A little bit. Nothing that has ever been published or seen the light of day, unfortunately, but behind the scenes, I have done a little bit of that. It is something that I love and I wish I could do more of, but it just doesn't always work out or come to fruition completely to the end.
Yeah, it's a good exercise. It is difficult to find somebody that is willing to do it, though, because you'd say,
Yes.
hey, even if it's another writer, and you're like, do you want to write a short story together? And then
Mhm.
I think it's either schedules or control, and there could be other
Well,
things too. But I think a
you
lot of it is people don't want to relinquish that control of it.
that definitely could be a little bit of it. It takes a lot of courage to do collaboration, honestly. You have to be on the same page with people. You have to kind of be talking the same language, and not that you couldn't figure out how to talk the same language, but now you're taking up time. You can't just sit down, okay, let's write something together. You need to learn a little bit about this person and how they communicate, where they're coming from with their ideas and what they're saying. But it takes a lot of courage to collaborate because, like you said, you have to relinquish some of that control, and you have to be willing to hear criticism. You have to be willing to give criticism. It has to be uh I don't necessarily like this term, but I can't think of a better term. It has to be a very safe place, especially as creatives. Creatives tend to be kind of emotional people, and you want to make sure that you aren't getting overly attached to something just because you've written it and you think it's good. You have to be coming to that collaboration a lot more objectively and a lot more open-minded.
Yeah, it feels a lot different when you're operating on the other person's premise or their idea. Like they
Mhm.
give you the initial, this is what the story's about. And you're like, oh, okay. Well, then you just talk a little bit about it, ask some
Right.
questions, and you go, okay, well, let me see the first chapter, the first whatever, and then I'll write a little. And you're trying to match up the person's style so it doesn't sound like two different people wrote the story.
Mhm.
So I think after, if you have a story or anything that's written and you can't tell who wrote what part, that's fun.
Yeah.
That seems like a success, in even if it's never published. So maybe it's the amount of time also that people have to put into it, or it could be one of those things where you make a plan to do something and then immediately after you make the plan, you regret it, and not regret it to the point like it's going to be a problem, but just now it's a thing you have to do, and that's
Mhm.
one more thing you have to do. I understand that. It's oftentimes when you say, let's meet at 12 o'clock and play pickleball, and you're like, yeah, that sounds great, and then you've just made the plan, even if it's days before, you regret it after you stop talking to the person. You're like, oh, geez, now I'm not in control of that part of my life anymore. I got to be at this place at this time. That sounds like a job. But
Yeah.
yeah, I think it's worth the effort of the collaborative writing, because it turns into, often, you're just trying to make the other person laugh, is what I found. Where you're writing this thing, and you'll write pages that will not be in the final draft, but or you just put in little things to see if the other person catches them, and then they do the same thing and you're laughing at it. That's what makes it more fun, I think. But
Mhm. A
maybe
lot of
if you're
times
writing a
it
serious book, it's a problem.
and that's something that, even though some of my collaborations haven't necessarily produced a finished product, it's been the connections that you make in the process that have been so special to me about the collaborative process. I mean, I remember one of my very first songwriting collaborations between me and two other people, and the song at one point just became completely unimportant because we were becoming friends in the process, very close friends. And, those connections that are going to last a lifetime. And that became so much more important than the actual project. And that's something that I really appreciate from collaborations.
Yeah, it makes you see artistic things, or just created things, which everything I guess is created in some way, that you see them differently, and like you'll take songs apart when you're listening to them, and I wonder how they figured out to put the bridge there and do that change and use those words there and then repeat them over here. It's interesting. It's a behind
It
the
is.
scenes or behind the curtain type look at stuff, and once you have done it, it's difficult to not see that anymore, to
Mm-hmm.
not understand what's going on. And then when you hear somebody say a writer knows every word that's in the book, and then you write a book and it takes you however long and you're going through however many drafts, and then you go, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I understand that now. It
Yeah.
is every word, because sometimes people will say, why'd you pick that word there? And you go, well, that's a big story, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I do find
What
some of those people who analyze things, sometimes their take to be rather funny though, because there've definitely been instances like what you just explained where that was a decision that you made, and there've definitely been things like that in my music, and people go, "Why did you do that?" And I'm like, "Oh well, yeah, that is a decision that I made. You want the full story on that?" But then there's other things that are just part of the flow of it, and especially I've always found when I get into a project and things just kind of go on autopilot a little bit, and it's almost like a dream, and then you wake up one day and you have this finished product and you go, wow, where did that come from? And not that there's not going to be editing after that, but a lot of times maybe there isn't that much, and you go, wow, why did I decide to do that? Because that really works. And like, I don't know. And then I'll watch interviews with people, or people who have broken down these songs, and they're explaining in this song, not a song that they wrote, just another song, and about what they did here and what they did there in this chord and the way this lyric goes, and they're analyzing this and giving probably what they think is the reason for it. And I just kind of laugh sometimes. I'm like, was there a reason? Was there really a reason behind that? Was there a thought
mm,
process, or was it just part of that person's flow, something that they felt in that moment that you can't put into words. You can't explain your reason for it because it was an emotion. And, these people trying to analyze it, and it is really interesting, and it's a great way to learn for people who are trying to get into that. But creativity isn't always that way. It's not necessarily something that can be analyzed or have a reason behind it.
I agree. I agree. Sometimes the people explaining it, you can tell it's just bull, or they look at it and they've heard somebody else describe it some way like that, so they're going to use those words to describe a thing that's not what they're describing. Not to say that art can't be different for different people, that it can't be the same thing, can't be a different message for someone else.
Absolutely.
I can appreciate that. Like,
Yeah.
that's one of the great things I think about poetry, is it can mean one thing to someone and something totally different to someone else. Of course, it depends on the type of poetry. If you're doing just regular rhyming poetry, it's probably pretty clear what it's about. And then if you're doing free verse, it could be strange, and who knows where that's coming from.
Yeah.
But if you talk to somebody else that has written poetry, they understand that. That's you see that look of, yeah, I've been there before, I know what you're talking about. And that's fun when you see that in another creative person, and it's not just someone repeating words they've heard but they don't understand what it means.
Yeah.
That connection with creativity, I think everybody has it, but everybody doesn't engage with it as much as they could.
I agree. I think it is something, and again, as a Christian, the greatest creator was God, and he created us, and I think he put that in each of us. And whether it's for us to actually create, like you said, not all of us do that for whatever reason. I think at the basis of it, though, it's there so that we can appreciate, because I think without any creativity, we wouldn't be able to appreciate creativity. And so everybody has that inside, so that we have the ability to appreciate the world and the way God created it, and things that people create, that we can appreciate art. I think it helps with our understanding of it.
Yeah, it's the reason why you look at something and you think, I like that. I don't know why, but I like that.
Yeah.
Like, you can go out and look at nature and be mystified by it. And then you could look closer and see the patterns at how things develop, and the Fibonacci sequence and all those. And you go, wow, it's more than just chance. So that's interesting. Creativity recognizes creativity for sure.
Yeah.
How do you have any other ways that you kind of quiet your mind to focus when you want to do any type of artistic or creative venture?
Just being by myself really helps with that. I tend to be an extrovert, and I love talking, and putting myself in a situation where I have nobody to talk to kind of helps with quieting my mind, because if there's somebody around, I'm going to be thinking of things to talk about. Um, and it's I've also just found that learning myself and sort of the situations where I find myself able to be most creative, for me, that tends to be first thing after I wake up or right before I go to bed, and not shying away from that, not going, oh, well, I can't get started yet. I still have to get up. I have to get dressed. I have to have breakfast, and just saying, well, why not? Just take the time. My mind is thinking about this right now. My mind is focused on this. It's not focused on other things. I'm calm, and uh, I've been able to sort of recreate that. So if I want to get into writing something, that especially something that's a little bit bigger or a little bit more difficult for me, I will go into my room and I'll close the door, turn off the light, and that way it's dark, it's very calming, and it's sort of replicating that feeling of, in the morning right after I wake up or right before I go to bed. And it really helps to isolate my mind and help me get away from any distractions.
That's good. I find a lot of when I'm doing something that maybe could be considered monotonous, or like mowing the lawn, running, things like that, that I can think, my mind can think about something else while
Mhm.
I'm doing whatever I'm doing. Sometimes when you're driving, but maybe that's not the best thing. I do think a lot when I'm driving, but like in swimming or in the shower is where the mind just seems like it's doing its own thing. And maybe it's because the water is there too. Read a lot of articles about how moving water produces negative ions, and negative ions are good for people. It's calming to people. So that's
Hmm,
interesting to
that
think
is
about.
interesting.
Yeah.
'Cause I definitely have had lots of moments I've started telling myself, "I just need to start taking my phone in there with me," because, that way, first thing when I get out of the shower, I can make notes of things that I thought about in there. But, yeah, I have definitely come up with a lot of things in the shower, but kinda back to what I said earlier, I think a lot of it too just comes down to, knowing your mind and knowing how you can put it into kind of flip that switch and put it into that space of, I want to focus on this subconsciously and let my mind ponder these things.
Yeah. I think that's the importance of exposure to all different types of creative, artistic things. And maybe, I don't know if they do it as much in school as they used to, but I never thought that art class was that important. But thinking back on it now, is it gets you that exposure to the different mediums of how you can express that creativity, how it's going to come out. And maybe, I think everybody can do all of those things, but for some reason, people tend to like one more than the other. And it can always change through your life. Like, you might not like sculpting, but then one day you're like, oh, I've got this
Mhm.
extra firewood and a chainsaw, so I might have to see what I can make out of that. That it's You got to have the exposure to that stuff so your mind can realize if that's something you can use. If not immediately, then maybe later. Maybe you're writing a song sometime and you think, I need to visualize this more. I need some clay and make this thing to visualize it. And now it
Mhm.
helps write it, or otherwise enhances that creativity, gives you a different perspective or angle from it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
What do you think the reason for existence is?
Well, like I said, I'm a Christian, and so I know that our existence here is to glorify God, and second to that, it's to tell others about him. So it always very much saddens me when I hear people who uh may be getting older and they think that they aren't going to live much longer, and it to me it's very sad because they don't recognize the gift of every day that they're here and how they have a purpose here. And like I said, I the first two re- reasons that we are here are to glorify God and to tell others about him, and each day is an opportunity to do that, every hour, every minute. And so there is always a purpose. There's always a reason for somebody being here.
I've had this conversation a lot with some people, so I've thought about it a lot. But what do you think glorify God means?
It means to honor him in the things that we do and to always give the praise to him and to try and live our lives the way that he wants us in. A lot of that, can be broken down into other things, utilizing the talents that he has given us, the gifts that he's given us, uh, again, for his glory, to point others back to him. It's as a creative, it's something that I've thought a lot about, and in like the parable of the servants with the talents, they were each given talents, and the one buried it so it was safe. The other one, he invested it a little bit and he got a little bit in return, and the other invested a lot and got a lot in return. And it was the one that risked so much in order to get the most gain, that was the most praised, because he didn't hide the talent so it would be safe. And when Jesus returns and we stand before God, we want to hear him say, good and faithful servant. We want to have fulfilled the purpose in our lives of being here that he put us here for. And whether we know the exact reason for that or not, like I said, it always comes back to glorifying him in the way that we live our lives, and pointing others to him, spreading the gospel, and sharing the how to be saved with people.
It's one of those things where, as a kid, I wondered when people talked about when in Sunday school, and they talk about you're here to glorify God, and I always was like, I wonder what that is. Like, obviously, you want to do things that please God. You know, that think about Jesus getting baptized, and then God saying, "That's my son, of which whom I'm well pleased."
Mm-hmm.
That's good. So, how do I do those things? And then, what is glorifying God? What am I going to do to glorify God? And I understand what the word means. I understand what honor means and all that. But how do you, what do you think the reason God put us here is? Like, what, I mean, besides the idea of glorifying God, what does that mean? And do you think there's some specific reason that a human can understand of why we're existing?
I'm not sure that I can answer that fully in kind of the way that you've described, but God is a creative God, as I mentioned a little bit ago, and he created this world, partially I think for his pleasure, and he created it perfectly with no sin in the world, and it was supposed to be a beautiful place. And he created man and he created woman from man and put them in the garden so that they could live and he would have fellowship with them. And not that God needed companions or anything like that, but I think God took pleasure in creating all of this. And because we know that it saddened him when man sinned against him. Uh, but looking back at that, I think it was partially because God took pleasure in it. And also, again, back to glorifying God with it, because we know that all creation did glorify God. All creation still does glorify God. It points us back to him. And even though the world has become corrupt now, and there's sin and bad things that happen, creation still cries out to God. And whether obviously that's not literal, it's something a little bit more spiritual perhaps, but uh you can recognize that if you have the Holy Spirit. But if you want like rules to live by, that this is going to glorify God gives us some rules. He gives us rules throughout, things that we should do and shouldn't do, things that are immoral, and things that if you look at the 10 commandments, I mean, those are rules, and we know that following those is going to glorify God. Breaking those rules is not going to glorify God. So there are definitely rules in the Bible that God has given us to live by, and saying this is how you can glorify me and honor me in the way that you live your life. So, I don't know if that really answered your question or not.
Yeah, I mean, it's a thing I've thought about a lot, so I'm still
Mhm.
thinking about it, is when you look at the definition of glory, to cause or be or seem glorious or excellent. I don't know if that explains it, especially to the 8-year-old me going to Sunday school. Like, even the adult me, I go, okay,
Mhm.
I understand what glory is. I understand glorify. I just wonder specifically, and when you put it with the parable of the talents, that I wonder if the reason we're here is to experience and have a perspective of life. Like that's what we're here for. Like go forth and multiply all that and take the talents, take the risks, and get the I wouldn't say that, I guess you could say the reward for it, but the proceeds of whatever the risk is, that the reason we're here is for the perspective and for the experience. So when you look at bad things that happen and people say, how could we have all these fires, these earthquakes, torment, war, all these things? How could God let that happen? One, I think it's outside of the understanding of people to understand the mind of God. But
Mm-hmm.
I think for the human mind, the way I think of it is you're here to understand these feelings, or to experience the feelings and see the perspective of your singular set apart life, that you can try to understand other people's, you can try to understand yourselves, but like that's the reason you're here. And that's why you can say, even though bad things happen, God still sees it and goes, okay, it's you learning these feelings, learning this loss and heartache and elation and all these different feelings that maybe you wouldn't otherwise know wherever it is we are when we're not here.
Mm-hmm.
That for some reason you have to have this vulnerability of being a human to be able to feel fear and all these other things that maybe you don't feel in eternity. Or that I do wonder, this where it gets into the what my people I talk to about it would call the more heretical views of whatever I'm thinking, is that I'm making up my own religion. I don't think that's what I'm doing. I'm trying to understand,
Mm-hmm.
why we're here as much as I can. I do accept that there are things that I won't understand because I'm just human and that's the way it
Right.
is.
Yeah.
But I wonder if there are some parts in the Bible that talk about where Jesus talks to people, and other times where they say that we are like God. And I know the context of them, and they're taken out of context a lot. I can't remember the verses. Obviously, if it's Jesus talking, it's New Testament. But I wonder if we are all a part of God. Does that mean that we're set apart from God, or that we are pieces of God? And the idea that God can't understand fear because God's all powerful. And that's weird to say, that God can't do something. But you come back to that story of, it's not in the Bible. It's just somebody, some philosopher, I can't remember now, said, can God make a rock that's so heavy that God can't lift it? And then you go, oh, wow. And there's great explanations of that on both sides of that debate of why it's a false dilemma, but it's also still a thing that you're wondering, yeah, my human brain can't wrap my mind around that, because God, of course, can make a rock that's so heavy. But if God can do whatever he wants, then he can make a rock that's too heavy for him to lift. But why would he? I don't know. There's a lot of
Yeah.
things to think about with just that. You don't want to get lost in it. But if God is all powerful, how does God understand fear? And what if a way God understands fear is through us, these little pieces of, whether we're pieces of God or whether we're just creation set apart that God knows everything about, that we're out here experiencing fear, experiencing all these things, this powerlessness. And then God goes, okay, now I know what that feels like because I've seen that experience and that perspective from this creature. These two are my creatures, as you would say.
Yeah.
But
I would disagree with that. I don't I
okay.
don't I don't think that that comes into it at all, because as you mentioned, God is all knowing, God is all powerful, God created those emotions. So, if he created them, to think that he doesn't know what the experience of them is like, I would think would be untrue. Just like with when Jesus was here, because Jesus was all man and all God. He was fully man and fully God. But Jesus wept. He experienced sadness. He experienced grief, and so he experienced these emotions. All emotions, even anger. God, Jesus experienced righteous anger. So we know that these emotions God created. He experiences them without our help. And so I don't think that that would play into, but we also know that God created the world perfectly. There were no bad things happening in the world until man brought it into the world, until man sinned, and now these things happen. God does not create the bad things. He does not make the bad things to happen, but he lets them happen because it's now a part of the world. The world is sinful. The world is corrupt, and so these things happen as results of things. It's for every action there is a reaction, and so it's a reaction to sin and corruption and evil. And so could God create a rock that's too heavy for himself to lift? I would disagree with that.
There is
Again, it goes a little bit beyond our capability as humans to understand, but just because I can't really completely imagine it or visualize it doesn't mean that it's not true. And that's where faith comes in. And that's what, God tells us, is that we have to have faith in some things. Some things aren't seen. And, blessed are those who don't see and yet believe anyways. And so we have to have that faith. And I think a little bit of that is a test of our faith. Some of these things that we can't understand is, how much are you going to have faith in God and what he says when he tells you these things that we can't understand, that we can't see. So, we just have to, it's not blind faith by any means, because as a Christian, I experience God every day of my life, and so I know he's real. I believe his word when he says he's real, and the things that he's doing and can do and is going to do. And so I believe all that, not necessarily because it's been proven to me, but as I continue to believe, it continues to get proven to me.
It makes sense. We are definitely in a fallen world.
Yeah.
I like the idea of God creating emotions. I need to think about that some more. That's a good one to ruminate on.
Mm-hmm.
The other question I'd have then, if God is all knowing, is it becomes, how does God know everything? How do you learn, or how do you know everything? And I'm not saying God doesn't. I'm just saying,
Mm-hmm.
how did that happen? How did that occur? So those are just the things I think about when I'm wondering things. And I
It's the same
understand
question, I guess,
I
of.
can't see the edges
Mhm.
of it.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to say, it's along the same lines of, people who have the question of, where did God come from? We don't have an answer to that. We weren't there. God tells us he has been here since the beginning of time. And so God has essentially been forever. And we, in our infinite, our finite minds, can't grasp the concept of eternity, either preceding us or proceeding us. And we understand, okay, well, there's going to be eternity after us. If we're Christians, we're going to spend eternity in heaven. If you're not a Christian, you're going to spend eternity in hell. But what about before the creation of the world? We know God was there, and we know that heaven existed. We know that angels existed. We know that God created the angels, which means he was there before the angels. So in a way, like, okay, we're going to pick out the things that we can understand and say, okay, God tells us he's been here forever. What does forever mean? We can't really comprehend, but you can just trust in this fact that God says forever. Okay, then he's been here forever. And so how did he become omnipotent? How did he become all knowing and all how did God achieve these characteristics? We can't understand. We don't completely understand supernatural things. We don't completely understand what it's like to be God. But then again, I don't think I'd want to. I don't think I would ever want to be on the same level as God. and nor would I want a God who's on my level, because then what's the point of it? What is the purpose of a God who's no greater than man? And I find a lot of peace in the fact that God is greater, that God is all powerful, that God is all knowing, because it means that I don't have to be.
It makes sense. It's good things to think about, I think.
It is a lot to think about. It definitely is. And, that's we can never completely understand or know things, and that's one of the beautiful things about life, I think, is that we have the opportunity here to continue learning, to continue gaining knowledge, and to continue pursuing God. And that's something that's going to take a lifetime. And it would get kind of boring if we knew everything right up front and there was nothing left to learn.
When you do your film projects, doing the videos for your music, what kind of like technical stuff do you use? What kind of camera do you use, and how do you record it and mix
um
it?
Most of the music videos that I have filmed on my Sony camcorder. I can never get these letters correct. It is an MC 2500, I think. I've had
Okay.
it for close to 10 years now, actually. But it has been my steady sidekick on most of my project. It's been wonderful for me. I filmed some things on my iPhone, uh, but most of it is done on my Sony camcorder. I edit in Final Cut Pro. I finally delved into that world back in 2020, and learned how to use it and have been in love with it. It is amazing. I love Final Cut Pro. It was definitely worth the investment in it. Still something that I'm learning. It's
Mm.
definitely a big learning curve, but it's been wonderful for my stuff. I Back in 2022, I got into recording music, producing music by tracking and mixing my own songs. And I just use GarageBand for that, actually. I don't use the big one. I just use GarageBand. I find it to be quite adequate for what I need, and I think that's part of being a successful creative, is knowing where limitations are, and what your budget is and what's necessary and what's not. And GarageBand has had pretty much everything that I would need at the current time, but that's because a lot of my stuff is mostly straightforward. I believe in recording doing the best tracking that you can, getting the best sound you can right in your initial recording. And then it shouldn't need a lot of mixing. And if it does, we're just talking basic things like compressors and EQs. And then, you know, so I like to keep things rather minimal and let the music be sort of the main objective of it.
Yeah, GarageBand. With any of those things, I think that you find one that has the abilities that you are looking for, and then you figure out how to use it.
Hmm.
And once you figure that out, it's hard to switch to another one. There's plenty of similarities between them.
Yeah.
Like Final Cut and CapCut have some similarities that you could switch back and forth pretty easy. And even GarageBand is that visualizing the whole thing out in front of you and then being
Hmm.
able to mix the pieces. That
Yes.
has to be so much easier than it was before that. Like I remember my first recording on a Tascam 3-track and then doubling up tracks to be able to get 7 in. And now you look at just GarageBand and you go, man, this is great compared to what that was. And you can visualize the sound and see all the pieces of where it's best to match them up versus
Yeah.
just, okay, stop right there. Oh, okay, stop right there. And then put it together.
Right. Yeah.
So
It is wonderful, and it has given the ability to a lot of people who wouldn't otherwise be able to create music, and like myself. And it but I will say I do miss a little bit of the way things used to be recorded. I am a little bit of a recording history buff, and I really enjoy learning, and I would love to have the ability to try some things. And I've tried a little bit of it, just sort of incorporating some of old things. I recorded I play with a classic country and rock band, and we recorded an album back in 2023 and released it. And we recorded it, the full band, around, well, it's just four of us, but the band around one microphone. And that means that you couldn't really do a lot of cut and splice because we're not playing to a click track. We're not recording separate tracks. It's everybody on one microphone. And so everybody kind of had to be right. And believe it or not, there was one song on the album that ended up being one take. It ended up being the first take that we did. And it's that kind of thing that I really miss about some older recording methods where that wasn't really an option, because you would get into a groove with your other musicians where you all are on the same wavelength. And this happens sometimes in performances. It's what you hope happens in performances. And it is so special. You can't really even describe the feeling to somebody who's never experienced it. But the feeling when everybody is so tight and performing on the same wavelength, and like you just play everything perfectly. There's no intonation mistakes. Nobody messed up a lyric. And even if they did, sometimes those things are insignificant because it makes it more human. It makes it more real. And those mistakes, who, is somebody else going to notice it? And even if they do, is it going to be such a big deal? There's definitely some things that are going to be a big deal, but for the most part, like if it's little, if it can be insignificant, it could be hidden, it could just add to sort of the nuance of something like that. And I think we miss a lot of the nuance in a lot of recordings these days because we do have the ability to cut and splice every half second if we want to.
I wonder if that's why around the time where CDs started, you had more live recordings became more desirable. Like I remember for me, the Tesla 5-man acoustic jam was the first album, and I didn't have the record, but I had the tape that you're like, wow, it's all out there happening at the same time. Then MTV Unplugged started doing things, and you go, okay, that's fun to see because there are the little whatever happens, and you have to just keep going with it. So the live performance is, it's interesting to see. It's good to see.
Yeah, it is. I much prefer live, and that was one of the reasons why when we were recording the album we chose to do it that way, was because we are live performers. We aren't recording musicians, we gig and we play before a live audience, and that is where we're best. And we wanted to try and capture the spirit of that on the recording. There is just something really special about live music. And like you said, it's because those things go wrong, and it's how you handle it. It really helps you to connect with your audience sometimes. So it's definitely fun.
I think too, it gives you the connection, even if it's pre-recorded studio stuff. It sounds doable. That you go, oh, I can play that. I could do that. So you're listening to it with that enjoyment, and you're thinking, well, I mean, I'm not going to, but I could. If I applied myself, I could do that. There's not a lot of mystery to it there. And I think the simplicity of it is what attracts the normal ear, that it's not overdone. But when I talk to sound engineers, you can't listen to things with them. I mean, they can't listen to them like, no, it's like a writer watching a TV show, and somebody says or does something, and you go, okay, well, I know that's coming back again. And there's things you notice and see that you didn't before you wrote that stuff. And I think that's you get with a sound engineer, is I don't think they listen to music the same as the rest of the people do.
No, and I just as a musician, that happens all the time. You can't go to a show or a concert and you just sit there and enjoy what's happening. You're analyzing everything, and not even intentionally, but definitely even in the last 3 years since I've been doing sound engineering, and it's definitely happened. And now I can't listen to things the same way, and I'm going, oh, listen to the way they recorded that. Oh, listen to the way they mixed that. Yeah, you definitely are
a little
picking
bit too
out
much
things.
mid in there. Yeah. Bring that down. Where's the bass? Where's the bass? Well, okay. So you do music, acting, directing, and writing. Do you have any writing projects you're working on right now?
I do. Aside from I'm always writing songs, I am currently working on a couple of stories that I am writing. So I can't get too much into that, but they are in the works. They are something I'm working on, and I'm excited about them.
Do you set time aside for that? And how do you, if you do, how do you keep yourself writing? Like, do you use a topic and say, I'm going to write until I'm done with this topic, this scene, or I'm going to write for this amount of time, or I'm going to write for this amount of word count every day so you can keep it moving forward?
When I started this project that I'm working on, and it's probably the biggest writing project I've ever done, I I had the idea in my head and I kind of wrote it all down. And so everything that I had in my head, I wrote down, which was a fair amount of, just sort of how the story was going. But I found that when I finished that, I didn't know where to go next, and I could have sat down and made an outline like I learned to do in school, and sort of put all my ducks in a row, but I couldn't bring my head to do that, even though that's what, or I couldn't bring my heart to do it, maybe, even though that's what my head was telling me that I needed to do. And I got a little scared over it, actually, because I felt a little overwhelmed about what I had just bitten off. But I felt so invested in this story that I knew that I was going to have to write it at some point, and it was getting it out of my head and actually getting it on paper. And so I kind of ended up in this tug of war a little bit of trying to figure out how to write this story, because any other time I've written much shorter things. And so it's not that difficult to write it linearly and just sort of like from beginning to end. But with this, I've found that again, with the just kind of putting it in the back of your mind and seeing what your mind comes up with, and I would just all of a sudden have dialogue pop up into my head, and so I'm playing out this scene in my mind, and I'd go and write down the scene. So I actually have uh chunks of the story from all over the story written down. And right now, my goal for this year is to go through and finish writing it by compiling everything that I've written, putting it in the right order, and actually figuring out how this story is going to flow. Because, like, I know the beginning, the middle, and the end, and I have chunks from all over the story. It's just actually getting it written and getting everything in between written so that it actually is a story now. And in the last year, I didn't do much writing just because my health wasn't very good. And so I had other things that I had to focus on for work that I actually had to do. This is more of sort of my side project. And but this year I have sort of tried to schedule my time a little bit better so that I have time every week to just focus on this. This day I'm focusing on this day I'm focusing on that, and giving myself time. I'm not pressuring myself to do it even every day. Just if I could sit down and write some once a week, I would be very happy with it, because it would be more than I did last year. But that is kind of what's happened to me. But this, like I said, is sort of this is the biggest project that I've ever done. A lot of my projects have been much smaller, so it's definitely been an interesting journey trying to figure out how to navigate putting something like this together, especially because that's the way it is in my head, and I know I need to get this out on paper, but actually telling the story, because I can see it visually, it's putting it into words.
It's tough when you set something aside, like you're not working on it all day or not working on it every day, or even if you are, if it drags on too long, then you start to forget parts of it,
Mm-hmm.
and or it's not like in your ready memory, and it's back there, and you can look at it later and go, oh yeah, that I got to tie that in with this and do
Yeah.
this with that, and it gets to be so big, you got to take that step back to see the whole
Mm-hmm.
picture, like you're
Right.
right in on it. So
Yeah, and that's one of the
I've
reasons that I found it was very important for me to, instead of going just thinking of it and going, okay, when I get back to it, I'll do that. No, I write down like if the whole scene, like all of the dialogue, everything right now, so you don't forget it. And over the last year, I was doing that. So I was writing over the course of the year, just not very intentionally. It was
mhm.
like when I was thinking about it, but I would go through and read what I had written occasionally and go, okay, yeah, that works. And I would just kind of ponder and let that stew around in my head for a little bit and go, do I want to add anything to that? Is there anything, where is this going to go from here? So I just found it really helpful to make sure that I was very intentional in writing down the thoughts that I had, because I knew that this was going to sort of be over a good chunk of time and I didn't want to forget any of it.
Yeah, for me, different types of writing are different. If you're writing a book, it's like a stew.
Mm,
It's it's on there, it's simmering, you're adding things to it, it's still developing. You can come back to it. It could be there for hours. So in writing time, it could be years, whatever. And then short stories for me, if you get the idea, you need to write it immediately. It's almost more immediate than poetry for
mm,
me, because poetry, I can write a note down. And because maybe the poem is not pages and pages, you could have time to write it all right then. But a short story, you're talking 1,500 words to 7,000 words, or sometimes more, depending on how people call short stories these days, that you go, wow, this is an idea, and I could write down the idea in my list on my phone that says short story ideas. That's now 60 or 70 pages long. Or once I get that idea, I have to write that story now. So it's stop everything else. And now I'm going to write 1,500 words, 3,000 words, whatever, on
yeah.
this short story. And maybe look at it like exploration mining too, because sometimes you'll get it 1,000 words in and you're like, this is not going where I thought it would. That's good. It could also be bad, and I'm never going to finish this. So I'm going to set it aside and forget about it in the stack of short story ideas. But
Hmm.
so I think short stories, write immediately. Poetry, you can take a note, come back on it later, after you get out of the shower, after you swim, while you're working out, while you're listening to music, piece that thing together over time, and that's going to work out okay. But that story, the novel, however you broke that up, the three, one, whatever, that's the stew that you can't leave on the stove forever, but you need
Hmm.
to check on it every now and then, see what's happening with it.
Yeah.
Eventually, the smell is going to be all over the house, so you can go, I think it's almost ready. So then you have to give it that more attention. But if you take that, set it aside in the refrigerator and come back to it later, it's not going to be quite right, because you're not going to remember all those pieces you put in to make it. And
Yeah.
hmm, it's I think if you can say, I'm going to write on this novel, either tell yourself, I'm setting this aside because I'm not good enough to write it right now, or I don't have the understanding of things that I need to, or I don't have the time. So I'm going to set it aside. It's on my things to do list. As Andre 3000 said, some time must be invested for this to be manifested. So that's going to need to cook over there a little, but not cook
Hmm.
in the sense that it's on the stove. So otherwise, I would say keep it fresh in your mind, and then use the word count and say, I'm going to write on this 1,000 words a day, 3,000 words a day, 500, 200, 30. I'm going to write 30 words on this a day. And at the end of the week, I'm going to have something more than I had when I started. I think that's the difference between the writer and not, of course, again, as you're writing. And
Hmm.
for me, with poetry and writing, I feel like I have to earn it every day. Like, I
Hmm.
can't say I'm a writer if I didn't write anything that day. So that means you might just have to write a letter to somebody, and then you could say, I did 250 words. That's pretty good.
Yeah.
And then go on about doing something else, work on a song, play an instrument, do something, so you can say, today I was a musician, today I was a poet, today I was a writer. And maybe some days you're all of those things. But
That's definitely how it feels sometimes. It's especially in the work that I do because it is so multifaceted. And, I'm not just a musician, I'm not just a writer. I also do my own marketing and promoting. I also do my own
Mm,
graphic design. I built my own website, and so all of these things is like, well, today I guess I'm a computer tech,
yeah.
and it can be very overwhelming. And because you do get this sense of I need to be doing all of it every single day, and it's just not realistic. There's not enough hours in the day to do it all, because some things take more time. You can't just do like a little tiny bit. It's like, well, I'm just going to practice this instrument for 15 minutes a day. If you're working on a concerto, no, you need some more time. You need at least half an hour to work on that if you're actually going to make any progress. Not that 15 minutes isn't going to make you progress, but it's not going to make you progress very fast.
Mm.
And or you're, especially with my mind, I find it to be a little bit all or nothing, and I have to sort of try and corral it sometimes, and convince it that it doesn't have to be that way. Because I get this feeling of like, well, I go have this project, I'm going to sit down and do it all at once, and it's not reasonable for some things.
Yep.
And trying to figure out how to break that down while also, like I said, with somebody like myself who, if I skip marketing one day, it's like, well, that didn't get done because there's nobody else to do it. So I have to try and find a balance of doing things when they need to be done, doing things when I feel inspired to do it, and doing things, just to maintain things. It can be difficult sometimes.
I like the weightlifting motif that if you try to do a 700-pound squat, you're going to hurt yourself.
Mm-hmm.
But if you can do a 50-pound squat, then that's, do the 50-pound squat 14 times, you know, maybe you're lifting 700. That it's about the reps. You got to get the reps in. So
Mm-hmm.
sometimes I'll say that to myself. That's usually when I'm trying to psych myself up to go work out. But it's the same thing with writing. Is when people say that thing of you have to show up, and a lot of people say, you're just sitting in the chair and then doing it, or showing up, putting the time in. That I think there's a lot of truth to that, but then you have to actually sit down and do that. You have to,
Mm-hmm.
and if you say, I'm just going to write 30 words a day on a project, that's still at the end of the week, at the end of the month, at the end of the year, more than you had not writing anything on it. Like keeping it
Absolutely.
fresh. Like I have a couple projects like that right now where I'm trying to write books in a series, and I'm like, man, now I got to go back and read all these books again, and it becomes that too heavy a lift, so you don't do
Yeah.
it because you're like, I can't do it all. I can't, my mind can't hold it all right now. And then you find out what's most important. What you really want to work on is what you want to do the most. Like, what am I willing to put off to do this other thing?
Mm-hmm.
So now you know maybe what you should be doing and then what you want to do. So you have to balance that passion of this with the, you have to do this. Like
Right.
I got to do this stuff for the marketing versus I want to write a song or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah. I like the balance for maybe winding things up. How do you keep track of the stuff you do write? Like if you end up with all the notes in your phone, and some of it is a line from a movie that you're working on, some of it's poetry lines, some of it's songs, some of it's quotes from a book that you're working on. How do you organize that once you get to the point where you've written it down?
Uh, if I'm understanding what you're asking correctly, I actually got to the point a couple years ago where I got really frustrated with the lack of organization of all of it. And I went through every single note on my phone because that is where I make most of my notes. And I also have journals all over my room with notes in it. And I sat down and I took every single note from every single journal and every single note that was on my phone, and I compiled them in one document
Mm,
on my computer. And so this one is lyrics. And even if it's just one line, like it gets its own page because that lyric could manifest itself in a full idea sometime. Maybe I'm going through, like, I feel like I could write a song today. I pull up my document and I look through, and if there's something that strikes my fancy, I go, okay, I'm going to ponder on that. and maybe I come back and I finish that page on the document, and actually have a song written about it. And I have one that's for poetry, and I have a document, and it's all the poetry I've ever written, and it has all of my ideas. And again, it's one page for each idea that I've ever had, and it really helped keep me sane in sort of just having everything in one spot, but also allowed me to be able to find something that I was looking for if I wanted to. Maybe I went, oh, wait, didn't I have an idea about this at some point? I go to the document and I can search it, and I go, oh,
Mm.
yep, there it is. Especially, I mean, that's one of the great things about technology, and that's why I took all of my journals and I said these need to go on the computer, because it's just too much at this point. It's too many notes, it's too many ideas, and I need to have them someplace where I can search through them.
Yeah, the power of the keyword search is real. That's a good
Yeah.
one. That's a good reason for having the document with everything in it. What I normally do on my phone, because I'm an analog kid, I think. So it's all on the phone. And when it gets to the point where I have to scroll 3 or 4 times to get to the bottom to say what's on my
Mhm.
grocery list versus what did I write down when I was waiting in line at the store. So I take that document, email it to myself, and then print it out.
Yeah.
So now I have it. I can erase it off my phone.
Mhm.
So now I need to work on it, because now it's these treasures over here that I'm going to start adding different things to the phone almost immediately. So then I have this document. I have it in case I need it. I print it out, and then I physically cut it up into, this is a line from a poem, this is a quote from a story, this is an idea for a story, this is an idea for a short story that's never going to get written because I didn't do it right when I thought about it. And I do all those things, put them in separate piles, and then you can go, okay, now I need to take however many minutes and filter these lines down to whatever story they're supposed to. Or I take the poetry pile and I can arrange them in different ways because I have time and dates on all the lines. I could
Mhm.
I could do it chronologically, but often I'll go, what was I thinking about then? And I can group those together, and maybe there's a poem in there that I wasn't aware of because it was just scattered all
Mhm.
through. So then you can arrange those how you want, tape them to another piece of paper, and you have it. You can change the order around, but then you have to do something with it. So eventually you're going to have to get down to the final product of, this is a poem, this is a scene, this is a quote, and put those in the right places. But that helps
Mhm.
me visualize it more and then be able to move it around physically.
Mhm.
But then you also have the document that you could search if you needed to,
Yeah.
and then it gets back to, did I use up everything? Did I use up all the clippings from this? And if I did, then I need to note that on that document so I don't go back to that later. And if I didn't, I need to keep these somewhere so I have them to add to the next time I do it. So
Yeah.
it's,
I would probably be a lot more analog in the way I do things if I could write as fast and legibly as I can type.
mm,
My problem is that I get such full thoughts all at once that I will lose it if I don't get it down immediately, and I can type so much faster than I can write, which means that I don't forget any of it.
yeah.
So that's been one of the benefits of why I tend to do a lot of my writing on my phone or on my computer. But I have definitely been there where it's like I need this physically in my hand. I need to be able to actually like move this around physically.
Mm.
I've been that way with storyboards for music ideas and things, and it's like I'm printing off all these pictures and everything and all of my ideas because I need to be able to see this in a bigger scope than I can do on my computer. It starts feeling claustrophobic on there, and you go, I need this in my hand physically.
Yeah. Either that or you need some giant computer screens where
Yeah.
you can look at it all at once and go, I'm going to move that over here and that over here.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
What's the best way for people to be able to follow your work?
Um, I'm on Facebook and Instagram and YouTube. I also have a website, and I have a platform on my website called The Community. And it is a paid subscription to be a part of that, but That is kind of the best place to follow me if you are up for that. Otherwise, social media is free, and I do try and post stuff on social media as well. So, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube are the main ones. But if somebody wants to hear my music, it's on all of the streaming platforms. Just search my name, search it online. My website will come up, my social medias will come up. Just search Emily E Fink.
Nice. And in the show notes, I'll have those links for Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and your website, so people
Thank
can
you.
check those out if they want. Is there anything you wanted to talk about that we didn't, or any thoughts you have in closing?
I don't think so. I really appreciate having me on. This has been so much fun. I really enjoyed it. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for being on. I'll talk to you at the end of this musical exit here.